Good morning and welcome to June 2022's Real Estate Live UK programme. Thanks for joining us for this first session of the day, our London Keynote. The Real Estate Live UK programme takes place 3 times a year and is brought to you by White Label, our partners and our sponsors. Before we get underway, we'd like to thank our partners and all those organisations contributing to our panels this week. Places across the UK will be showcasing themselves to investors and developers, and industry-leading experts will be exploring ideas on how the property and regen sectors can continue to thrive as we discuss key topics, including free ports, the rise of industrial logistics sector, and the role of culture in creating and sustaining communities. You can find out more by visiting our website, www.realestatelive.co.uk. Right now, we have our London Keynote, and we'll be asking, is London embracing the build-to-rent market? We're joined today by our panellist, Jonathan Martin, who is Director of Inward Investment and HE Academic Relationships at Waltham Forest Council, Jim Eaton-Terry, who is Chief Technology Officer at Quintain, and Brendan Geraghty, who is CEO of UKAA. So just before we start, I'd like to remind you, the audience, please do feel free to ask questions using Zoom's Q&A function. And now I'm pleased to hand over to our chair for this session, Jo Gumb, Director at White Label. Over to you, Jo.
Thank you, Shelley. Welcome to all our delegates. I can see you filing into our Zoom room through what always appears to be a very small Zoom door at the moment. I'd love to welcome you to this REL session, which is called Is London Embracing the Build-to-Rent Market? I think the answer to that question is already known as a clear yes. BTR has already become a cornerstone of the London residential market, and we've got new providers moving in, the current market leaders expanding, and I'm told that the sector accounts for about 1 in 5 of newly completed properties in the capital, though I suspect Brendan will correct me on that later, because I know he's got better data than I have. There's no doubt that London and UK as a whole is becoming a place for renters, and BTR is often presented as the solution to London and indeed the UK's long-term housing crisis. It's a concept that's equally well suited to house the mobile professionals that London needs to remain globally competitive, and it is also a solution to providing homes for our essential workers, for families, for older people, and Generation X, who are now looking for independent living but are finding it harder to get on the ladder for a property which they would buy into at a younger age. But like any new trend in housing, BTR won't come without its challenges for all of us. The infrastructure, the financial models for the investment, for its long-term viability, sustainability, and its need to remain a desired option for home seekers. So to help us consider how BTR can establish itself as a successful long-term model for our housing, I have one of the most experienced group of panellists I could possibly wish for today. Brendan, CEO of the UK Apartment Association, Jonathan, who is the Director of Inward Investment at Waltham Forest Council, and Jim Eaton-Terry, who's the Chief Technology Officer at Quintain. Just before we start, I'm going to remind you yet again, this is an open session, and we would like as many of you to participate and engage in the conversation as we talk around the issues, the challenges and opportunities presented by BTR. So please, will you pop some questions in the Q&A function? You can do this at any time. You won't interrupt us. We'll be very happy to answer them and put them to your panellists. And I would request that you use the Q&A function rather than the chat, because that way I am much more likely to see it. And we'll reserve the chat function for networking and for putting out information that becomes relevant as we go forward. So to get us underway, I'm going to say, Brendan, welcome very much to this morning's session. And perhaps you can give me a greater insight in how has the build-to-rent sector grown in London.
Good morning, I'm very pleased to be here. So the UKAA really is the authority on build-to-rent in the United Kingdom, and we really look at this emerging sector, not just in London, but across the entire nation and into Scotland and Wales as well. I think that build-to-rent is establishing itself. It's still pretty nascent, if we're going to be honest, but it's growing very, very rapidly, and the commitment or the appetite for the development and investment sectors for build-to-rent product is very, very strong. So London started the build-to-rent revolution, if we want to call it that, and it's increasing. You know, the Q1 reports, Q1 data from this year show a 12% increase on on stock in London. This is a little bit down on last year, which was at 20%. And the regions are sort of taking over in terms of volume, but that's only because build to rent started in London, it then went to Manchester, and now it's really expanding across a lot of the regional cities. So it's still very substantial force, new force in London, and London continues to lead the sector. Muted.
No, my unmute button was uncooperative. Thank you very much, Brendan. I'm going to move on now to Jonathan, which is to ask, specifically, I suppose, with reference to Waltham Forest for this perspective, although I appreciate you have a wider perspective as well. So how is Waltham Forest now looking to incorporate build-to-rent developments within the borough? And what do you think those developments need to deliver to make them successful for the borough's residents?
Thank you very much, Joe, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. I am really pleased with how the borough has embraced build to rent, particularly because it wasn't something on our horizon when we started looking at our local plans and area action plans and so forth back in 2012. So the first thing I'd say that really helps in terms of bringing forward this particular type of housing is having flexibility in how you bring forward your planning system so that you can allow for things to be created into existing areas. So we looked at a number of areas, particularly in terms of growth back in 2012 and 2014. And one of the areas that we focused on was around Black Horse Lane, which became our housing zone in 2016. And at that stage, we hadn't really fully identified all of the housing typologies, the housing tenures, but build to rent soon became one that was coming to the fore. So we worked with investment houses such as Legal & General, which were excellent in terms of bringing forward a build to rent product there at Black Horse Mills. We worked with Taylor Wimpey, who then sold on an interest to Fizzy Living, who brought forward a build to rent scheme. And more latterly, we worked with Telford Homes at Equipment Works, which has now gone to Granger Henderson, and again, Greystar, beg your pardon, Henderson. And that has again seen a large influx of new housing on the build to rent sector. What we've noticed is there has been a really keen uptake in those particular homes. And what we've done to support that as a local authority is really produce an urban design framework to knit all of these sites together. So there's a red line around the whole section of sites, and there was in excess of 5 different landowners, and we had to work together to bring them all into one large landowning sector and work group. And we also brought on board shared services, particularly around energy. So again, we saw that as a key way to start to get everyone thinking around the wider estate. So estate-wide issues, estate-wide opportunities and matters, making that urban design green. So there was a great deal of greening that went into the spaces between the developments, between the actual blocks themselves, ensuring we had garden space, ensuring we had balconies that again promoted shared space and obviously communal areas. And we've seen that really bear fruit in terms of what's happened at the station hub sites over at Black Horse Lane. The other thing I think that's really key to this, and again, in terms of what we're doing around looking to the future, is making sure that these developments come forward, particularly around transport nodes. So at Black Horse Lane, for example, we've got the tube station that sits on the Victoria line, but we've also got the overground, which goes from Gospel Oak to Barking line. So we've got that tube and overground alongside the bus network. And again, looking to the future, we've got a large development planned for the town centre of Walthamstow, which is seeing discussions ongoing with Capital and Regional, our main shopping centre owner, along with Long Harbour. So again, that's going to bring forward over 500 homes. And we think, again, the amenities around that are really key to sort of embrace supporting that better living offer that you get from people wanting to come into an area, but aren't necessarily immediately tied to it as they're renting. So I think that's another compelling argument to sort of support the future. Those would be my initial reflections, Joe, just in terms of observations from our experience. But we can see the market still growing, and we're still getting repeat requests for future sites from our existing investors. So that's always a keen sign to show that we're working well together, and it is co-creating these locations.
It's good to hear the appetite's still there. I noticed you talked about how popular these have been with people looking for their own homes. And I suppose that does segue me quite nicely to Jim. to try to talk about what solutions you have been able to come up with, but mainly technological, I'm guessing, at Quintain, to make these more appealing, more desirable, better resident experiences for those people who are moving in.
Yeah, thank you. Nice to join you. I think the key thing, the first thing, is probably just making sure that people have connectivity, which is always the first thing and the last thing people ask for, making sure that's seamless, making sure you can use it anywhere, whether that's in our co-working space or in the apartments or out and around the estate. So we put a lot of focus on that. The other place where we're able to reduce a lot of the friction is on the move-in and the leasing journey, particularly if we're having people who are moving to London for the first time. We're able to do a lot of remote access, a lot of virtual touring, so that people know where they're moving into before they ever need to come and visit the estate, which works well, is really helpful. The most fun thing we're playing at the moment is how we can get data about buildings and the experience into the hands of residents. So whether that's giving people more access to their usage of utilities, which is obviously useful from a sustainability point of view, or as simple as giving people access to see how busy gyms are, how busy shared spaces are, so they don't make their way all the way down from their apartment down to a gym and find they can't get to use a machine they want. So I suppose those are the first few sort of small things that in different ways help tie together the experience.
Thanks very much. I suppose now I'm going to open it out a little bit more to you generally. So I suppose given my own background, I'm quite interested in how schemes like this can be catalysts, I'm guessing, for improving places, for creating regeneration, for bringing forward places that people really want to live in. So I'm actually going to look to Jonathan first for this question, because I do know your background. Are there ways in which that BTR is not just providing places for people to live and indeed wider improvements, but genuinely can be used as catalysts to regenerate areas?
I think that's a great question, Joe, and the answer is yes. It's clear from our experience that Build to Rent has really given a high level of confidence to renters who are obviously looking to have their homes brought forward with certainty and security, that there's a standard there. There's also the amenities around them in terms of potentially when they're not at home. Concierge services are something we've seen come forward quite significantly. We as a council are looking at supporting that through particularly things that we can achieve around, for example, the 15-minute neighbourhood. Can we provide all the other support and amenities that allow our residents and tenants of these buildings to really feel as if they're at home? So they've got the essential services within a 15-minute walk or cycle time. That we see as quite significant. I think, again, in terms of just looking at what we've seen work within a number of the developments that we've seen come forward, it's that high quality public realm, it's the high quality offer of the actual developments themselves. And it's the support that we can see. I had to spend some time in a number of these developments recently, just in terms of having some impromptu meetings and observed the sort of community feel that was there. So again, it's about how you establish that community feel, but again, have the sort of access to, the green space that you need as well. And as was mentioned, the great transportation links, so people can get to and fro where they want to be. But I think because of what we've been through over the last 2 or 3 years, there's a big issue around the sort of shared space, and making sure that you have got shared space that's functional, but also gives people that space where they can access the health and wellbeing requirements that we all have in terms of being part of a community, but also when you need to, being able to work productively without necessarily having lots of interruptions. So I've seen a lot of things grow within the borough, particularly around the areas I've mentioned previously. But again, I think a lot of it is around working together in a collective way. So what we've seen really well in terms of joint working has been around that sort of landowner estate-wide approach, so that there isn't just a red line around one site, it's around the whole estate. And it's how you can bring forward that kind of cohesive approach to an area. The other thing I'd sort of just touch on quickly is things such as, particularly around Black Horse Lane, we've got a BMR, we've got things like Yonder, which is a climbing facility with a coffee facility there as well. We've got a number of other things that support that sort of living, particularly around the creative sector. So there are other things that are clustering around this sort of build to rent that I think help support it and make it more of a compelling opportunity for people who want to rent there.
Thanks very much. Yes, I think it's interesting as well, whether or not as part of the BTR, and it's something I've come across elsewhere, you can almost create that 15-minute neighbourhood that everyone talks about, where you have your work and everything employed. So yeah, and thank you. You're making it sound so lovely. I'd quite like to move there. Brendan, I'm going to turn to you to see if you want any input in this, particularly I'm guessing with your architect hat on, about how schemes like this can be more than just places for people to live.
Yeah, I mean, I think Jonathan's accurately and in a very detailed way described the sort of physical characteristics of build to rent. But I think that the attraction of build to rent is not just on the physical quality of the apartments or the houses or the public realm. I mean, that's really, really important. It's also about the community that's created and that sense of belonging that goes with that community. And there's two bits to this. Build to rent is pioneering a customer centricity. You know, tenants are a legal term for leases. Customers suggest that there is a care dimension, an overarching care dimension. And I think build to rent is pioneering customer centricity and consumer culture in residential real estate, which is a place that hasn't visited very often. And so we're seeing this consumer culture emerging in the build to rent sector. And I think it you know, at the end of the day, I think that build to rent delivers more of Maslow's hierarchy of needs than any other form of residential real estate to date. And interestingly, I was at the housing conference up in Manchester yesterday, and the overriding theme of that conference, there's lots of things going on, but the golden thread running through that conference is the care they have for their communities, for their residents. It really resonated with me. And I thought, you know what, build to rent is no different. The golden thread in build to rent is that we care for our customers. We want them to stay. And the way that we go about that is to provide really good quality accommodation and really work hard to develop community, because once there is community, not just within the block, but within the wider context, the sense of belonging, the sense of well-being, and all of those other things start to be able to be played out. And really, that's what build to rent is offering. So from a regeneration perspective, from a quality of life perspective, yes, the physical stuff is really, really important, but then so too is the emotional stuff.
Thanks very much. I suppose looking at emotion, that might sound a strange way for me to look at Jim, but actually, you obviously have a lot of data and lots of capacity to make us feel better, using that data to give us as tenants, as customers, however I would like to put it, a better experience. What do you think people are really looking for, and how that sense of community can be developed, perhaps, using some of the more modern technology available to us all?
Thank you. I mean, I have to say, although I'm probably going to end up pivoting to technology, I don't think that's really a technology question. I'd really share everybody's view about it's about building neighbourhoods and building communities. And we obviously, as well as having our own developments around the estate for shopping, for leisure, for lifestyle, we also work closely with Brenton, with our big neighbour, the stadium, to try and make the whole area, lift the whole area and make it somewhere great to live. I think in terms of the ways we can use data to build communities is something that I think people, and we're among them, are only really playing with it now. I think there's a huge danger of being creepy with it. There's a huge danger of being overly marketized. It has a lot of challenges, and really the way we approach it is that it's never about a technology solution. What the technology solution can do, and we focus a lot on, is can we make sure we can give enough time for our residents team so that they can spend time thinking about residents? Can we make life as efficient as possible? It always comes down to a conversation. It always comes down to people and places. Making sure that there are really, really good spaces within the estate, making sure that within an individual development, our residents feel like they've got a home around the building really, really works. That's why people stay, I think, and that's where community starts to come, because they'll share the spaces. And then you get, we've got the running club that one runs in one direction around the stadium, and there's a walking group that walks in the other direction around the stadium at the same time. So they all get to meet each other once a week. Those things, we didn't set them up. We didn't create them. But if we can create the conditions for that kind of things to grow, and we've got our community centre that we run, which brings both the wider community and the community within our buildings together, all of those things create the conditions in which the residents are going to build the communities. We can't build the community. All we can do is create the circumstances where it happens.
Thank you. I think you're right. It's that combination of people and places and how that can be supported that appears to make the difference in creating something that is successful. I mean, looking at success, I suppose the question from me, which is probably going to come around to all of you in just a minute, is what are the key challenges in putting some of these schemes together? And I suppose more importantly, how can they be made financially sustainable for the long term? Because there's quite a lot that goes into them, from trying to get landowners together through to coming up with a model where you have shared services. So there's a lot of financial modelling behind this that is presumably dependent on a flow of income. And I was wondering, just how does that work if you're looking 20, 30 years ahead? Can that model be sustained? That's a really tough question. And I'm going to start with Jonathan.
Thanks, Jo. I'm really, again, pleased at what we've seen happen in Waltham Forest, primarily because we've been looking at how we can do exactly that. We're working with investment houses that have got 50-year modelling in terms of their investment in these areas. So we see them as very, very welcome, patient investors, looking at the sort of long term. I think the thing we've really appreciated in terms of being the public sector facilitator is how we can support these areas to be more attractive by what we can achieve in terms of bringing in the social infrastructure. So the school places, the medical places that we need, the active transport and active travel that we can get people to really start to pivot towards and have that kind of modal shift, as they say in the parlance, which is getting people out of cars and onto their feet and onto cycles. We think that helps grow places. And in growing places, once they're out on their feet, it starts to build the sense of community as well. I think there's a lot of soft infrastructure that we have to do as the public sector. So we're doing a lot of work around putting in, for example, relevant to the examples I've given, Walthamstow wetlands, the largest wetlands in Europe, 211 hectares of operating water reservoir, but it's open to the public, it's free to access. And it helps people get into understanding biodiversity and so forth. We're near to Epping Forest. We're really pleased at how that's come forward in terms of access to again, a natural forest, not far from a number of our particular key locations. I think the other thing that's really key is how we can support that sort of community feel. And again, it's a legacy of what we achieved in terms of borough culture in 2019 around getting people to meet each other, putting these events on that get people to start to appreciate their neighbours, start to appreciate diversity and inclusion. And I think that's a really important point around making people feel welcome. So, starting to celebrate the differences, but getting people to understand that their neighbours, whether they're within the actual build-to-rent block or across the street, are within an area that starts to have its own character. And that's something else that, again, I think is really key, which is making sure people feel there is a character to an area. Because in talking to investment houses, what they've said to us is it's all that support and infrastructure that makes a place more attractive. And that then gives them that sort of longer term certainty to invest in the mid to long term. And that will keep their residents, their tenants, their customers, to Brendan's point, wanting to stay in the locations they are, because quite frankly, they can quite easily move after the lease expires. So there's an ongoing need to make sure that we keep that welcome alive. But the other final point is around making sure you've got the right investment around the public realm, making sure that it's durable and you've got the right investment to ensure that you've got the constant sort of funding to keep it at that top level. It's no good making it look brand spanking new at the beginning and it looks tatty after 5 years. It's got to be maintained as it were when it opened. Those would be my sort of initial observations, and hopefully those reflections complement my colleagues.
Thank you very much. I've started to get some questions in on the feed, so I'm going to encourage people to put a few more of those in while I just put that initial question over to Brendan to say, what do you think are the greatest challenges in delivering build-to-rent schemes from your perspective?
I mean, there are a number of challenges, but if we just continue with Jonathan's point about the investors, I mean, it is a long income model. So there are two pieces of real value. I actually think there are three pieces of value, but there's the asset value and the rental value, or the rental income that really is attractive to the investors. But I'd also suggest that there is the community value or the brand value that will be associated with the development. but build to rent is already institutionally recognized. Student took 20 years to get there. Build to rent did it in 5. And what we're seeing with that is that the ultimate market is the institutional market. There may be transactions along the way, but that is patient capital. And I think that once we see the influence of patient capital on a development process, there are different dynamics at play. Aspects of life cycle costing, wanting to make sure that the asset that is purchased is actually, I won't say fit for purpose, but certainly will perform as designed. And that's not just from an economic perspective, from a revenue perspective, but from also an operational and performance perspective with net zero in the background. So I think as we've moved forward, or as build to rent has gone forward, there's an awful lot of built to sell assets which have been converted or repurposed for build to rent, and that's a natural thing, and that will continue. But what we're seeing now is more sophisticated requests coming from the investment houses and the lenders. They want to see evidence that things are working. They want to see evidence of a tenant acquisition and a customer acquisition and a customer retention strategy. They want to see that the building will work, and not just the building working, but it works within its community, to Jonathan's point about integration and really partnership. So that I don't think we can have a long-term success story without long-term negotiations and long-term conversations over time. But the barriers to successful build to rent are we're still competing with with the for sale market, certainly with respect to land purchase. The overall viability is different, so it is tricky. So what we're seeing is different models coming forward. We're seeing short lets being part of the residential mix, because that does help with revenue and provide a diversity of income. But I think most of all, the biggest barrier, there are financial and commercial issues, but I think the policy position, and perhaps just generally as a society, we're still trying to understand what this build to rent thing is and how we should best deal with it. I think there's no consistent position nationwide, perhaps not even in London, although London is better. And I think that as that understanding matures, we will see the policy barriers become easier to negotiate. And I think that as investors see the value of a long-term position on the development side, they will see that value returned to them.
Thanks very much. I have a little question in my feed, which is about policy, but just before I turn to that, I'm going to just quickly turn to Jim, because you obviously sit from the other perspective, because Quintain has obviously had to be in it from that long-term investment perspective. And given the investment you've been doing recently in Wembley Park, obviously there has to have been a very long-term model for that.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true, and I think I'd echo what everybody else said. I particularly echo Brendan's point about paying attention to thinking about the difference between a build to sell and build to rent building in terms of how you operate it, because how you operate it and the more complexity we create by developing buildings that are, I mean, the classic problem we have is as we open buildings on a 1-2 a year, each one is maybe a slightly different version because things have moved on. But then you have to think about the operating complexity of having different buildings with slightly different operating models, all of which drives cost and all of which puts pressure on the long-term sustainability of the model. So it's that focus on making sure you can drive out as much complexity as you can from the operation, because that is cost that doesn't gain us anything, doesn't gain our investors anything, and most importantly, doesn't gain our residents anything. And then we can focus on making sure we deliver what we want to deliver for residents while still making the commercials stack up. So yeah, that's kind of the way we think about it.
Thanks very much. I've got a question from James Pargetis, which is, in London, does the panel think that City Hall is supportive enough of BTR into the future? So Jonathan, I'm going to come back to you to start off on that one. See if you can think, is there enough support there for some of the complexity that you need to deal with to get these things off the ground?
Well, I think it's a really interesting question. And again, in terms of our relationship with City Hall, we've been really productive and had very close working relationships with the Mayor's office. We've secured significant grant funding to bring forward a number of our developments, and we've had support from the Mayor's office in bringing forward a number of the developments I've mentioned, particularly around getting more grant into those developments. So from Waltham Forest perspective, we're coming from a very healthy position of having support from the Mayor's office. I think in terms of that longer term, again, it may well be different in other parts of London, but we've certainly been working closely in terms of how we can look at, for example, bringing forward 17 and Central, the Mall shopping centre, which is owned by Capital and Regional. And we've got Long Harbour there that's going to bring forward over 500 homes, predominantly built to rent. And we've been working on off-site provision and how we can make sure that scheme integrates into the delivery of not just the build to rent proposals as new town centre dwelling, but also how we can work on transportation improvements as well. So there's been lots of discussions around how we can bring forward improvements to Waltham to the Central, major transport hub. So the fact that we'll get 5,000 square metres of additional retail space coming forward, again, acts really well as a sort of compelling reason why you'd want to move into a home in that particular development. But it also brings a lot in terms of the local residents, in terms of there's going to be a town centre improvement as well, in terms of the green space, the play area and so forth. So for us, it's been very, very supportive. I can only speak from our perspective, and there may be others that can share their thoughts, but we've had a very productive relationship with the Mayor's office, and certainly going forward, we'd like to see that continue. Hopefully that's helpful.
Thank you very much. That was very helpful. Would anyone else like to come in on that one before we move on?
I mean, I would just like to add to that. I mean, I think the Mayor's office is supportive. There's no question. And they're trying to make, they're trying to be as supportive as possible. They have their own restrictions and their own, challenges internally. But so the question to me is not, are they supportive? Because they are. But do we need to do more? Absolutely. And I think that we need to recognize build to rent for its unique characteristics, the speed it can be delivered, the contribution it can make to the levelling up program. I appreciate that's not necessarily a London issue, but it's certainly a nation issue, a national issue. And I think that a consistency across the piece would be, a great help. And I think, the London is potentially, very much more advanced in this regard. So is Manchester, and we need to share that knowledge. We need to expand it, but we also need to develop it and recognize there are very distinct differences between built to rent and PRS. PRS is simply about rental without any of the aspirations and baked in solutions around community, along long-term vision, about long-term settlements in a community and making that work. So build to rent has very different characteristics, and I think that needs greater recognition.
Well, thanks very much. I'm actually going to stick with you now, because my next question was to talk about where we are perhaps economically in terms of supply and demand. So I think I've picked up there is still a lot of demand, both from an investor perspective and from a renter perspective for these kind of schemes. But clearly there's a lot of talk out there about potential recession, potential fall in property values. Is anyone seeing an impact at this point on the build to rent market?
I mean, build to rent is, if you look at the numbers, there's at the end again, Q1, there were 225,000 homes. It's not a lot, compared to the nation, but it's moving quickly. London had 94, just over 94,000, and but it's still growing. I think the current situation with inflation, particularly as that's going to affect construction costs, that has a major impact on development economics. And of course, land costs are always an issue. But I also, going back to the point of more patient capital and a longer term view, if we're looking at it in traditional sales economics of 5 to 7 year cycles, it's incredibly difficult, and there's going to be some major challenges ahead. If we take a longer view and we look at perhaps different yields, if you like, then I think it's going to be a storm for sure, but it's a storm that can be weathered. So I think this is again where build to rent is able to take a slightly different view because of its fundamentals. But we are all going to have some very challenging times ahead, but hopefully they will be short-lived.
Jim, you're again seeing it more from that investment perspective. I know that Quintin's in it for the long term, but is it going to have any impact on how you look at what you're doing?
Well, I mean, I think I'd agree entirely with Brendan about construction cost obviously gets more difficult, and input costs generally in the operation do. What we're not seeing, I think, at all is any drop in demand from a resident point of view, which is the fundamental to what we do. So therefore, from an investment point of view, it's not something that I think affects our thinking very much at the moment. It's really around making sure we control, and we've been through previous difficulties with supply so we can manage it, just managing to make sure that we keep the fundamentals solid. And as long as the demand stays in place, which it so far shows no sign of declining, then we are still moving forward.
Thank you. Jonathan, is it going to impact at all?
Again, I think, Joe, it's a really interesting question just from the public sector perspective, and particularly us as landowners as well in the sector. We're seeing obviously the impact of the cost of living increase, which you just can't ignore in terms of how that impacts on people's ability to rent, to buy, and so forth. I think certainly there will need to be flexibility in the models that are brought forward. There's going to have to be a refresh around how we deal with affordability, I would suggest. And that's something we work really hard on as a local authority to make sure we can provide the necessary homes for our residents. So I think that those challenges will exist and continue to exist. I think, again, from a perspective as a local authority, one of the areas we will have to consider is the land supply itself. You know, how can we make sure that we've got our landowners in the right space to bring forward this kind of housing product for our potential residents and our communities. So those are the sort of three key things I'd observe in terms of challenges. And I think certainly in terms of what could address that and make it more of an issue around getting through those aspects would be the joint working that we've seen bring forward the schemes today. So I think a lot closer working in terms of identifying sites and working more closely with, perhaps the planning departments to see what's going to be, again, flexibly available. Would also help, I think, in terms of making sure you've got the pipeline in terms of that sort of planning regime, because clearly at the end of all of the discussions, you need to secure planning, which means you need to bring forward a high quality scheme and make sure it satisfies a range of planning policies that, again, are looking to really maximise the benefits for residents in those particular areas. So those are the sort of observations, Joe, that I think would be key. And again, I agree with my colleagues, Jim and Brendan, in terms of some of the challenges they've identified. We see that playing out in discussions we have with our investors. So, it's part of a whole answer that we've got to work on alongside working very closely with City Hall.
Thanks very much. I'm going to ask a slightly broader question now in terms of economics. And I suppose this is almost a levelling up question. If we become a nation that rents rather than is more tied to a specific place because we have a stake in a home we have bought, does that create a more flexible labour market because people are able to move more freely in order to take up jobs around the country? And does that cost of living impact on London likely to have an impact on whether people are going to move out of London to seek work, particularly if we match that with the current working from home requirement, which temporarily, I think, saw house prices move higher outside London, although I have a feeling that it started to switch back to the capital as people have started to realise the benefits of working in a place where there is existing talent and community and infrastructure. So that's a very broad question. And I think I might have a turn to say, Brendan, how do you feel about this? Because you obviously have a slightly more UK-wide perspective on that.
There's no question that Build to Rent can help to deliver on the levelling up agenda on a number of levels. One, it generally develops at scale. So most schemes are certainly 100 units, 100 homes or above in terms of blocks. And the emerging market in single family housing, which is going to be very, very strong, is going to make a very strong contribution as well. In terms of economics and communities, the most fundamental thing that people need is somewhere to live. And I think Build to Rent is already proving in the regional cities and the larger cities, Manchester, Birmingham, where I was yesterday, but the Leeds and Sheffields and broader still, that it's going in, it's developing schemes, bringing them forward, and then and bringing them to market very, very quickly. They also and that's attractive on all sorts of levels, and allows that shift outward, outwards and upwards, north into the north of the country. But also the product is different. So if I put my design hat for a moment, build to rent is designed around the way the residents want to live. So there will be to Jim's point, one of the most fundamental and most important pieces of service infrastructure and amenity is hardwired access to the internet, or very, very easy access to the internet, and very consistent and stable access. So that gives you that base to be able to interact both socially and from a work perspective. The buildings are designed with that in mind. There are workspaces. Very often the amenity play is flexible enough that there can be workspaces within the building, and many operators encourage that during the day by providing other services and support to those types of activities. So from a flexible working, flexible living and connectivity perspective, as well as speed of delivery and volume of delivery, Build to Rent is really pushing hard to be part of the levelling up agenda and to make a serious contribution to it.
Thanks very much. Jim, I'm going to look down to you, because I think probably this is going to be a question both for Jim and Jonathan. I'm working down in another part of the country at the moment where there's been a great concern to ensure that employment opportunities are and indeed connectivity are involved in any kind of these schemes to ensure that they are built around residents and built around a long-term creation of a community. How important is that, do you think, in terms of making sure that what you get is a development that has a community for the long term, I suppose, in wherever it is based?
I think it's absolutely central. And I think it also speaks to the earlier question around making sure that you've got, or we make a lot of effort to make sure we've got a balanced community, we've got different types of renters within the same buildings, within the same development, having the same experience, so that you are building a community rather than just dropping something completely from the outside into the area. I'd also, as Brendan said, making sure that there are spaces so that when you're talking about work from home, you're not always talking about work from home within the apartment. So we've paid a lot of attention to that. One of the things, my favorite kind of single data point that I like is that in the block I stay in, 5:15 in the morning is the earliest I've seen someone using one of our outside work from home sheds, and I've never seen them all empty. So it's clearly something that people value in terms of just being able to stay in and around your apartment, but not necessarily always needing to be in the apartment. That also speaks to making sure that you can connect to what you need to connect to wherever you are. But yeah, it's really important to have that balanced community in order to make sure that it does sustain over the long term.
Thanks very much. So over to you, Jonathan. How are our changing economic and labour landscape having an impact? Because I think, from London's perspective, one of your drivers, I believe, is to make sure that you have created homes for existing residents.
That's absolutely right, Jo.
Stay there.
Yeah, well, that's absolutely right. We're really keen to make sure we've got a jobs pipeline. There's been a lot of council thoughts gone into how we can deal with creating the right kind of environment to support jobs. It's one of our major principles of our public services strategy around making sure there are jobs for local residents. We are a net exporter, or we certainly were a net exporter of employees before the pandemic. And obviously there's been a rebalancing of that because of the kind of flexible working we've now seen come to the fore. A big part of what we're looking to do is really making it practical, so jobs academies, but also supporting our industrial sector, our employment sector. And there's lots of master planning and development frameworks currently underway, looking at exactly that, how we protect the jobs pipeline through these industrial and employment sectors, what we can do to start to ensure that where we do have build to rent coming forward, there are also opportunities for new jobs being created. I've mentioned a couple of areas previously. I've touched on the 15-minute neighbourhood. We're looking specifically at areas where we know there are large employment areas. And it's how we can make sure we can bring residential development as close as possible to those areas, but make sure it's balanced, but also have the necessary servicing requirements, and also ensure the enhancement of transportation is made clear as well. So I touched on the active transport that we mentioned before, but we've got things like HGV academies that we're bringing forward as a local authority to deal with obviously the HGV driver shortage. These are practical ways we can deliver improvements, and we've seen that really in terms of how we've demonstrated employment through jobs fairs. And again, this is something we've seen where we've run those really, really close to some of the areas I've touched on previously. So these are practical ways that we as a local authority can bring people near to jobs, near to new homes. And speaking to our investment houses, they want to also support that kind of growth around local jobs, because again, it gives that balanced community, and it also gives that resilience. One of the things we learned through the lockdown phases was that we had to rely on local resilience for distribution of food and so forth, as opposed to distanced deliveries. So this is something we want to keep close. This is why we've built on the 15-minute neighbourhood. We think it can only strengthen through active transport, but also making sure you're building these accessible ways for people to work more locally. And again, I think another point no one's really touched on here, because it's something we've looked at as, again, that sort of longer term jobs pipeline, is how we make sure the jobs that do come in and do get created are fit for purpose and future proof, because we were aware that pre-pandemic there was a risk to automation for a sector of our workforce. So it's how we can work with the upcoming employers to make sure that we've got quality jobs that come forward, and then start to make sure we approach that through education and better communication of what those opportunities are, so that people can see they are attractive, as opposed to perhaps not being as aware of the complete array of jobs that may be local to them.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to ask now for you to sort of put your futurologist hat on a bit. So you've all mentioned the importance of remaining flexible with schemes as they come forward, and that they change and flex, because no model is quite the same, because it has to be built around a community, or has to be built around all the connectivity and the different challenges that it presents, as well as what residents will desire and how their desires change over time. So if I ask you to just be futurologists just for a moment, can I ask just each of you in turn? I'm going to start with you, Jim, to say what do you think there's a future trend going to be, if you had to think about that? Do you think build-to-rent's going to change enormously from how it is at the moment?
I think that the answer probably has to be sustainability and information about sustainability for residents, and letting residents. We have paid and we continue to pay a lot of attention internally to our sustainability policies, but it'll be around how residents and work with us to make it a more sustainable community environmentally. I think that is the way, that feels to me like the thing that's most likely to drive changes in the way we operate the business over the next few years.
I think that's actually a very good point, because I know businesses are already deliberately choosing more sustainable offices. And I think people who are committed are also looking at more sustainable places to live, both in terms of maintaining lower cost and also in terms of personal preference. Yeah. Brendan, can I turn to you for that question about what trend do you think will drive changes in the way in which we operate at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, Jim is absolutely right. The climate crisis is by far the hugest issue that we need to address, and we will see the buildings changed to reflect that, and a great deal more pressure for the construction industry, more generally in the design industry, to demonstrate that the buildings will perform as designed. We probably just about can do net zero in use, but that's pretty recent, and the embodied carbon question is a whole other challenge which we are starting to address, and we'll move forward with that. But if we put climate change aside just for a moment, and we also have to mention here the building safety bill and the fire safety bill, which are going to have a root and branch impact on the delivery and the operation and the management and the maintenance of buildings, that's going to have a major impact. But they are, if you like, that's a sort of technical matter that owners will have to deal with, and those who design and produce these assets will have to deal with. If we look at it from a consumer perspective, from a customer perspective, I think if the Home Views reports on build to rent, which are now published yearly, clearly demonstrate the value of build to rent to the consumer, to the customer, when they get compared to sales product or even just standard PRS product. the evidence is now mounting that build to rent is valued for all that it offers, which is everything from the amenity to the quality of the homes themselves, and the flexibility that it gives them in terms of a lifestyle. Will build to rent ever challenge sales as the dominant the dominant model? No, I don't think so. It never wants to. It wants to offer an option to consumers, to customers, for how they want to live at any given time of their life. And everybody thinks it's a sort of millennial proposition, but the evidence suggests that those who live in a build to rent is a much broader church of people, a much wider profile. So I think we will see the rental living as a broader concept will just grow and grow and grow. We will see other forms of rental living like co-living and short stay accommodation and even into retirement being added to the mix. That will have its own challenges, but the value of rental through a professionally managed operational base and good quality accommodation, I think the market has been looking for that for a very long time, and we're going to see that grow and be valued by those people who sign up to live there.
Thanks very much, Jonathan. Just finally to you on this one, because I'm guessing that policy has a role to play in this.
Thank you, Joe. Yes, it does. And I certainly echo comments previously around how we can really make a difference as a local authority and the public sector. We've already declared a climate emergency. We've gone to get a number of action plans pulled together around how we're going to address that to get to net zero carbon by 2030 as a local authority. But I think in terms of how we can make a real difference from now going forward, there's the big issue around ESG, environmental, social and governance criteria, and what that means for us as a local authority, particularly around the social value side of what these developments can bring forward in the communities they're being delivered, is around the apprenticeships, the jobs pipeline, the other areas of vocational training that can be delivered for residents and communities here and now. And those wider benefits will again infuse people into supporting these developments coming forward. So it almost overcomes a challenge that may not even exist in terms of getting people to see that these schemes can deliver far more in terms of wider benefits that we're really keen to support. And our leader at Waltham Forest, Councillor Grace Williams, is really promoting that in terms of the wider benefits that these developments can bring for the existing communities as well as the new communities coming forward. So I think social value is going to be one that we really start to see get far more airtime and far more discussion on that policy basis as we work with the social value portal to start to articulate what we require as a local authority, but what that means for our investment houses, our investors and our contractors to show what they're delivering for our local communities, their customers and our residents and future residents as well. Hopefully that's helpful.
That's lovely, thank you. So just before I come to my last question, because I'm going to ask you all the same question in turn, I've obviously picked up a little bit from what we did, and I've started to write it down. I can get almost all of the things that I like about BTR and the things you've talked about it into C. So the thing I've picked up so far is connectivity, collaboration, the cohesiveness, the community-centric element of it, the contribution to the economy. And I've had to go for climate change friendly because S didn't quite fit in those nice collection of C's. But those are all the things that I've picked up very much from that wider benefit that Jonathan's just mentioned, that these schemes can generate for the places in which they operate. So just to close down now, I just want to ask if there is just one thing I want each of you to think of that would make the biggest difference to BTR's success in London. So just one thing. And I'm going to start with Brendan. What's the one thing that you would like to see to help BTR be successful in London?
I think that in London, it's largely already recognised as a force for good, and that it's as I've said before, it has support. I think it needs more support, and I think it needs to be uncoupled from PRS, and be seen for the wider agenda that it delivers on. It's not just about creating homes, it's about creating communities and communities within the building and within its wider context. It has employment opportunities, it has community opportunities, and of course it provides on the housing front. And build to rent is, it's generally recognized as being amongst the leaders in residential design for things like climate change, for well-being within the buildings, for all the things that the ESG agenda are going to ask of us. So really, I think my request would be that it's seen as a unique proposition, and it gets and is supported as such, and is and separated from the wider PRS economy.
Thank you very much. Jim, over to you. What's your one wish?
Actually, I'll give you another C. I think so. I think it would be certainty, and that kind of, there's two things in my head about that. One is kind of industry-wide, which is around making sure that rent control stays at a national level so that we can plan to it and we can give our investors certainty, because that's critical. And then on a very, very selfish front, certainty, Brendan mentioned the building safety bill, certainty around the data provisions in the building safety bill so that we can start planning so that we can meet them without having a tearing, scrambling hurry, which I suspect we're going to have. Those would be the two things, both around certainty.
Thank you very much. Jonathan, over to you.
I think I'd add to my colleagues' comments with another C or two, which would be co-creating the culture and making sure that we've got that shared ambition, that shared values, and that shared sort of vision for the future of the actual build to rent sector. It is something that we've seen really enter the borough of Waltham Forest from a standing start in 2014, 2015. And now it's a significant element of some of our key growth areas. So I think it is that co-creation and that culture that can be shared between the investors and also the public sector to make it work for those communities. So you get all those three C's rolled in together, Joe.
Thank you very much. My headline writing capabilities are still in there. Thank you very much to all of you. That's been a really interesting session, and it's really nice to hear about how BTR can play that role in contributing to creating places and communities where we would all like to live and work, which I think is an ambition that everybody would share. Thank you very much for that discussion. Thank you very much to our delegates. And now I'd like to hand back to my colleague Shelley to finish us off for today, as we'll move on to the next session of RAIL. Thank you very much. Shelley, are you there?
I'm sorry, I just couldn't get the start the video on. I do apologise, everybody. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Joe. Sorry to delay that. Thank you, everyone, to our panel for a great discussion this morning. Before we leave today's session, I just wanted to make you aware of the sessions we have taking place today. Starting right now, over on the other channel, we have a session in partnership with Ealing Council, Investing in Place. And then at 11:30, we discuss how will new free ports impact the industrial logistics market. Then we have our final session of today, which is at 2 o'clock, which asks, how can digital platforms and data be harnessed to modernise planning and engagement? And if you can't make a session, do not fear. All sessions will be recorded and available on our YouTube channel by tomorrow. Just search for Real Estate Live UK. To stay up to date, also follow us on LinkedIn. And just like on YouTube, search for us you can search for Real Estate Live UK. Thank you for joining us all again today. And we look forward to seeing you again soon.